when we speak of the displacement of Japanese families during World War II. We are not telling one story, we are telling many. By August 1945, almost 6.9 million Japanese were residing outside the current borders of Japan, 321,000,000 civilians and 367,000 military personnel, around 9% of Japan's population. These millions were scattered across an empire that stretched from Manchuria to the islands of the Pacific, from Korea to Southeast Asia. But displacement did not only affect those abroad. The strikes conducted by the United States Army Air Forces on the night of the 9th of March -10, 1945, codenamed Operation Meeting House, constitute the single most destructive aerial bombing raid in human history. 16 square miles of central Tokyo was destroyed, leaving an estimated 100,000 civilians dead and over 1 million homeless. Across Japan, an estimated 300,000 to 330,000 Japanese civilians were killed, and at least 8 million left homeless by firebombing, with an estimated 40% of Japan's urban areas destroyed. And in America, about 120,000 people of Japanese descent were forcibly relocated and incarcerated in 10 concentration camps operated by the War Relocation Authority. About 2/3 were US citizens. This is the story of Japanese families torn apart by war scattered across continents, trapped in hostile lands, driven from their homes by fire and by government decree. It is a story of survival, loss, and the long road home. Part 1. The Inferno at Home fire from the sky in the early months of 1945, as American forces captured island after island in the Pacific. They brought the Japanese home islands within range of their most devastating weapon, the B-29 Superfortress bomber. American planners estimated that incendiary bomb attacks on Japan's 6 largest cities could cause physical damage to almost 40% of industrial facilities. It was also estimated that these attacks would kill over 500,000 people, render about 7.75 million homeless, and force almost 3.5 million to be evacuated. The nightmare became reality on the night of the 9th of March -10, 1945. 279 US B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of bombs, mostly 500-pound E-46 napalm, carrying M-69 incendiary bombs, killing approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night. Almost 270,000 buildings were destroyed, and more than 1 million residents were rendered homeless. Most of the victims were civilians, and most of them were women, children, and elderly, in light of the fact that the able-bodied menfolk were off to war, and the full-scale evacuation of these vulnerable groups from urban areas had not begun in earnest yet. Rivers of fire by March 1945, almost 2 million people had left Tokyo, but those who remained lived in a city where 98% of the buildings were made of wood and paper. These structures were no match for the almost 1,700 tons of incendiaries that rained down. Survivors described scenes of unimaginable horror. Yoshiko Hashimoto, a 24-year-old mother, recalled, the B-29s were dropping numerous firebombs, and it sounded like a squall. I was astounded to see the intensity of the air raid. I had never seen one before. Haruyo Nihei was just 8 years old that night. Her father, realizing fire was approaching their underground shelter, said they would be cooked alive if they stayed. There was a strong wind that night, and as I came out of the shelter, all I could see around us was fire. Burning clothing, tatami mats, and debris were blowing down the road, and it looked like a flowing river of fire. I remember seeing other families like us, holding hands and running through the fires, she recollected. I saw a baby on fire on a mother's back. I saw children on fire, but they were still running. The homeless millions, when the flames were finally put under control, 100,000 had died, and 10,000 people were homeless. Men, women, and children that lost their homes walked the streets, carrying what little belongings they still owned with nowhere to sleep. Access to basic amenities, such as gas, electricity, telecommunication, and water, had been almost entirely non-existent during the first few days after the bombing. Finding adequate food to eat had been especially difficult for survivors. Rations by the government were not enough to sustain, and the prices of food on the black market had been substantially inflated. The exodus began, with no homes, food and support from the Japanese government. Many of the homeless evacuated the city to be with relatives in the countryside. Evacuation was difficult as no official Japanese evacuation plan was put into place. Trains could only accommodate a small percentage of those leaving the city, so the roads were filled with a great exodus of homeless, taking what remained of their possessions on bicycles and carts. Further incendiary attacks were conducted against Tokyo, with the final taking place on the night of May 25 to 26. By this time, 50.8% of the city had been destroyed, and more than 4 million people left homeless. Tokyo was removed from the target list. There was simply nothing left to burn. The B-29s moved on to other cities. Tens of thousands more people were killed, and firebombs followed on the major cities of Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The bombers then targeted medium-sized towns, hitting 58 of them. 60% of Tokyo itself went up in flames, and similar fates befell cities across the nation. By the war's end, Japan was a nation of refugees in their own land. 8 million homeless wandered through the ruins, searching for food, for shelter, for family members who might still be alive. Part 2. Abandoned in Manchuria, the dream of empire for decades. The Japanese government had encouraged emigration to Manchuria, the puppet state they called Manchukuo. To populate and secure the territory, Japan initiated large-scale civilian migration programs, starting in 1932, targeting rural families and promoting agricultural settlement under the slogan of 1 million Japanese farm households. By 1945, the Japanese population in Manchukuo exceeded 1 million, including settlers, administrators, and military personnel. They had been enticed by the Millions to Manchuria campaign, begun in 1936, when Japan's farms faced stagnation amid a nationwide recession. Propaganda songs promised paradise. The pioneers of our great Japan, we divided the village, and went to Manchuria to build the paradise of the imperial way. We will all march together. These migrants formed self-contained Japanese enclaves with schools, hospitals, and shrines, replicating metropolitan social structures to sustain long-term residency amid a local Chinese and Korean majority. But paradise was built on sand. The Soviet storm, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, began on the 9th of August, 1945, with the Soviet invasion of the empire of Japan's puppet state of Manchukuo. The invasion began hours before the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and 3 days after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Inside Manchuria, Japan's Kwangtung Army was nowhere near operational readiness. Its best units had been sent to Okinawa and Kyushu months earlier. Few demolition charges had been laid, air support was negligible, and some senior commanders were absent from their posts. In the early months of 1945, tens of thousands of refugees from the Japanese home islands had moved to Manchuria with all their possessions, believing the colony to be a safe haven. Incredibly, no steps were taken to evacuate these Japanese civilians, on the grounds that such precautions would promote defeatism. Then came the betrayal. Abandoned by their army on the 10th of August 1945, the day after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, the Japanese army evacuated military families from Manchurian cities, cut telegraph lines, and blew up bridges, severing settlers, mostly women and children living in remote areas, from rescue. A Japanese general cabled, "Their only alternative is suicide." The Kwangtung Army, which was supposed to protect the Japanese settlers in Manchuria, quickly retreated and abandoned them. As most able-bodied men had been drafted into the army, the majority of Japanese civilians left behind were women, children, and the elderly, leaving them highly vulnerable. The sudden collapse of Japanese authority amid battlefield defeats and communication breakdowns left families isolated and vulnerable. Evacuation attempts devolved into disorganized flight, with settlers resorting to overcrowded trains, wagons, or foot marches southward. Mass death and mass suicide in Soviet-occupied Manchuria and North Korea. The repatriation of Japanese civilians was marked by violent expulsions, accompanied by widespread looting, mass killings, and mass rape perpetrated by both Soviet soldiers and local populations seeking revenge. A former Japanese soldier, Wakatsuki Yoshio, wrote in his memoir, "What word can possibly describe the violence committed by the Soviet soldiers on Japanese women? I can only think of the word hideous. The victim could be a girl of 12 or 13 years old, or an old lady of almost 70 years old. These soldiers did not choose the sites where they raped them, in public, in broad daylight, even on snow-covered roads." It is estimated that the number of Japanese women and girls raped by Soviet soldiers and local Chinese mobs reached tens of thousands, between 30,000 and 40,000. At a small town called Fengjiang, the Soviet army drew near. Mothers stared upstream and down. No boat came. Hundreds of Japanese women placed their children, some of them just infants, on the docks, stepped off into the current, and disappeared. Many of the settlers who woke on the 10th of August 1945 would not survive the fall of Manchukuo. Many committed suicide together. The death toll: a large number of Japanese civilians died due to starvation, disease, mass killings, and mass suicides. Approximately 223,000 Japanese civilians residing in the Soviet-occupied zones died, most of them within a year and a half after the 9th of August 1945. Although they made up only 17% of the 1.5 million Japanese living in Manchukuo, settlers accounted for nearly half its death toll. Some 245,000 people lost their lives in Manchuria, including those killed in the fighting with Soviet troops at the end of the war. More than those who died in the massive firebombing raids on Tokyo, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, or the Battle of Okinawa. Part 3. The Children Left Behind. Orphans of Empire. In the chaos of August 1945, as Japanese families fled for their lives, impossible choices were made. Parental decisions to abandon children stemmed from acute panic, rampant diseases like typhoid, bandit attacks, and acute transportation shortages that precluded carrying infants or young children. Many parents hid their offspring in homes or entrusted them temporarily to local Chinese residents or acquaintances, anticipating retrieval after escape. They never came back. These children, numbering in the thousands with incomplete records, indicating over 4,000 under age 13 left behind, predominantly in regions like Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolia, were frequently adopted by local Chinese families amid wartime devastation and famine, growing up assimilated into Chinese society, often without knowledge of their ethnic origins. This group of abandoned Japanese is generally referred to as the Zanryu. Hojin, children, are specifically referred to as Zanryu Koji, meaning abandoned war orphans. Most were adopted by poor Chinese peasant families and absorbed into the local population. Some led their lives as ordinary Chinese without knowing their background as adopted children or Japanese orphans until they were told in their 40s, 50s, or even 60s. The stranded wives besides the orphans, most other Japanese left behind in China were women. These Japanese women mostly married Chinese men and became known as stranded war wives, Zanryu Fujin. Because they had children with Chinese men, the women were not allowed to bring their Chinese families back with them to Japan, and most of them stayed. When the Second World War ended, Japanese people aged 13 years or older that were left behind were considered Japanese women left behind in China. If that person was less than 13 years old, they were a Japanese orphan left behind in China. Most of those categorized as Japanese women are female teenage girls were in demand among unmarried Chinese villagers, so Japanese teenage girls would be married off in the northeastern countryside, but teenage boys were viewed as useless, defeated enemies, and thus were mostly killed. The Japanese women trapped in Manchuria often had no choice but to marry a local to survive the ensuing post-war chaos. They often suffered great poverty and other hardships in an environment where wife-beating was common. Decades of limbo. Japanese war orphans left behind in Manchuria at the end of World War II are forgotten victims of the war. These 5,000 children were trapped in the strained post-war Sino-Japanese relationship, grew up in China were bullied as little Japanese demons, and then were persecuted as Japanese spies. During the Cultural Revolution, they experienced every imaginable human atrocity. They were shot or stabbed with bayonets, witnessed group rape, massacres, and mass suicide, became displaced persons in an enemy country, and lost their identities. The Chinese government estimated that there were around 13,000 survivors in 1959, at the time when over 30,000 missing people were deleted from Japanese family registers as war dead. Coming home to strangers. It was not until 1972, when Japan re-established diplomatic relations with China, that the orphans could begin searching for their families. Shifts in government policy over the decades have allowed more of these people to enter with their families and to resettle in Japan. Today, it is estimated they number at least 100,000 people. Among 2,818 Japanese orphans, 25,7 orphans now permanently reside in Japan. But returning was not the end of their ordeal. Upon delayed repatriation 4 decades later, they were despised as Chinese in their homeland. Immediately following surrender, women returning from Manchuria and men returning from Siberia experienced particular hostility. The women were regarded as unchaste and threatening the future of the Japanese race by bearing mixed-race children. War orphans would be relegated to hard labor jobs if they could find any at all. Even war orphans that accomplished the strenuous move were expected to live off meager 37,000 yen per month welfare payments post-retirement due to their late start working. In December 2002, 637 plaintiffs filed suits in Tokyo District Court, demanding approximately $173 million in damages and a formal apology, arguing that the government's failure to systematically locate and retrieve them from China constituted negligence. Part 4. The Siberian Gulag, Prisoners of the Cold War. While civilians suffered in Manchuria, Japanese soldiers faced their own nightmare. After World War II, Japanese personnel in the Soviet Union and Mongolia were interned to work in labor camps as POWs. Estimates for their number vary from 560,000 to 900,000. As the Japanese Empire collapsed in August 1945, over 600,000 Japanese soldiers in Manchuria surrendered to the Red Army and were transported to Soviet labor camps, mainly in Siberia. Domoi Tokyo. We'll take you back to Tokyo. This was what many surrendered Japanese soldiers and civilians were told by Soviet soldiers. However, instead of Tokyo, the Japanese were sent to forced labor camps in Siberia and various other regions of the USSR, including Ukraine, Georgia, and Central Asia. Imprisonment came as a surprise to the soldiers, who thought they were being shipped home, labor and death. During the occupation period, the Soviets put into hard labor not only 640,000 Japanese POWs, but also 2.38 million Germans, and more from 24 other countries, for a total of 4.17 million. The Soviet government desperately needed a labor force in the reconstruction of their country, as 30 million Soviet citizens died during World War II. The Japanese prisoners became a workforce for the rebuilding Soviets, as well as pawns in the Cold War. Alongside other Axis POWs, they did backbreaking jobs, from mining and logging to agriculture and construction. They were routinely subjected to reeducation glorifying the Soviet system. The conditions were murderous. The Soviet army rounded up around 575,000 disarmed Japanese soldiers and carted them off to the Siberian Gulag, where they were forced to labor in temperatures of 20 to 40 degrees below zero, on minimal rations. The extremely freezing winter in Siberia was very harsh for the Japanese to endure. Since Japan is a country of typically warmer weather, there was an unexpected death total of 5,000 in the first winter, from 1945 to 1946, which was 80% of the total death figure of 6,200. It is estimated that between 60,000 and 347,000 died in captivity. 11 winters of waiting. Although the US and Soviet governments concluded an agreement in 1946 to return Japanese POWs in 1 year, the Soviet government delayed and threw every possible obstacle in the way of fulfilling that agreement. It was not until 1956, 11 years after Japan's surrender and 3 years after the San Francisco Peace Treaty ended Allied occupation, that the last ship delivered 811 survivors from Siberia. The last major group of 1,025 Japanese POWs was released on the 23rd of December, 1956. From then on, some Japanese POWs were released in small groups, including those who would only return in the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Already laid low by war and years of hard labor, returnees faced the final shock and alienation of an unrecognizable homeland, transformed after the demise of the imperial state. Part 5. Incarcerated in America. Executive Order 9066. Across the Pacific, another group of Japanese families faced displacement, not by enemy action, but by their own government. At the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, about 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry lived on the U.S. mainland, mostly along the Pacific coast. About 2/3 were full citizens, born and raised in the United States. On the 19th of February 1942, President Franklin D. Ancestry Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 following the attack on Pearl Harbor. About 80,000 were Nisei, second-generation, American-born Japanese with U.S. citizenship, and Sansei, third-generation, the children of Nisei. The rest were Issei, first-generation immigrants born in Japan, who were ineligible for citizenship. Virtually all Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes and property and live in camps for most of the war. The government cited national security as justification for this policy, although it violated many of the most essential constitutional rights of Japanese Americans. Days to dispose of everything. Army-directed removals began on the 24th of March. People had 6 days' notice to dispose of their belongings, other than what they could carry. Anyone who was at least 1/16 Japanese was evacuated, including 17,000 children under age 10, as well as several thousand elderly and disabled residents. In many cases, individuals and families were forced to sell some or all of their property, including their homes and businesses. Within that period of time, camp residents lost some $400 million in property during their incarceration. Life behind barbed wire. Assembly centers were located in remote areas, often reconfigured fairgrounds, and racetracks featuring buildings not meant for human habitation, like horse stalls or cowsheds, that had been converted for that purpose. The Santa Anita Assembly Center, just several miles northeast of Los Angeles, was a de facto city with 18,000 incarcerated, 8,500 of whom lived in stables. The more permanent relocation centers were not much better. The Army-style barracks built to house the evacuees offered little protection from the intense heat and cold, and families were often forced to live together, offering little privacy. The residents were not required to work, but the guard towers and barbed wire fences surrounding the camps denied them the freedom to move about as they pleased. One internee articulated the bitter irony: if we were put there for our protection, why were the guns at the guard towers pointed inward instead of outward? Slow justice. By the end of the war, over 120,000 people of Japanese descent had been incarcerated, without trial, in sites across the western United States and Hawaii. It was the single largest forced relocation of people in U.S. history. On the 17th of December 1944, the exclusion orders were rescinded, and 9 of the 10 camps were shut down by the end of 1945. The last Japanese internment camp closed in March 1946. It would take decades for justice. President Gerald Ford officially repealed Executive Order 9066 in 1976, and in 1988, Congress issued a formal apology and passed the Civil Liberties Act, awarding $20,000 each to over 80,000 Japanese Americans as reparations for their treatment. By 1992, the U.S. government eventually disbursed more than $1.6 billion in reparations to 82,219 Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated. Part 6. The Long Journey Home. Operation Repatriation. At the time of Japan's defeat in August 1945, Around 6.6 million Japanese nationals found themselves stranded outside the country. This total was made up of roughly equal numbers of military personnel and civilians. When Japan formally surrendered on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September, 1945, there still were 7 million Japanese soldiers and civilians scattered throughout the Pacific and Asia, with no way of returning home. The Allies had so devastated Japanese shipping during the war that few transports remained. The situation for civilians was different from soldiers. There were no legal provisions in place regarding the repatriation of civilians, and the Japanese government was slow to respond to the developing crisis. In the earliest days after the surrender, the government even instructed Japanese nationals overseas to stay where they were. Depending on where they were, Japanese civilians were subject to the authority of 5 different zones of military control, each run by a different allied power: China, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain and the Netherlands, and Australia. The victorious powers varied greatly in the treatment they meted out to Japanese. The Strange Navy. By mid-September, a plan to repatriate Japanese personnel and revive the Japanese economy began to take shape. The U.S. Navy established the Shipping Control Authority, Japanese Merchant Marine, and the Japanese Repatriation Group, known collectively as SCAJAP. Toheisan Repatriation, South Carolina AJAP, gave Japan 85 LSTs and 100 Liberty ships that had been slated for decommissioning. SCAJAP also repurposed any seaworthy vessel it could, including warships, for the mass repatriation effort. The Hosho and Katsuragi, among the few Japanese carriers to survive the war, were given new roles as passenger transports. The fleet of cast-offs eventually grew to about 400 vessels. The Manchurian exodus. The Soviets had no interest in repatriating Japanese civilians left behind in Manchuria, and it was only after the withdrawal of the Soviet troops in May 1946 that repatriation finally began, using American transports. From May 7, 1946 until August 1948, about 105,000 Japanese people were repatriated from Huludao. Many had died in Harbin, Changchun, Shenyang during the preceding winter before repatriation operations began. Some of the people on board the first ships to leave had traveled 2,000 kilometers from the Soviet border to the port of Huludao in southern Manchuria, the departure point for the repatriation transports. Port cities like Darien swelled with refugees from Manchuria, many describing horrific scenes of fleeing both Soviet military violence and vengeance attacks from local Chinese. Many were forced to abandon children and were separated from family and loved ones, coming home to ruins. In the reconstitution of Japan after 1945, those who had lived or were born in the colonies were now labeled repatriates, hikiacha, a politicized category that served to mark them out from the rest of the Japanese population. This operated both legally, as official identity documents used this label, but also in terms of social attitudes and behavior. The repatriates returned to a nation in ashes, cities destroyed, economy shattered, families scattered. Many found that relatives had died in the bombing or in the war. Others discovered their family homes no longer existed. In 1988, the city of Maizuru opened the Maizuru Repatriation Memorial Museum. In 2015, materials documenting the repatriations were added to UNESCO's International Memory of the World Register under the title Return to Maizuru Port, documents related to the internment and repatriation experiences of Japanese 1945–1956. Conclusion. Echoes across generations. The displacement of Japanese families during World War II was not a single tragedy, but many tragedies, each with its own geography of suffering. In the home islands, 8 million people were made homeless by American firebombing, wandering through the ruins of their cities, searching for food and shelter. In Manchuria, over 200,000 Japanese civilians perished, abandoned by their own army, attacked by Soviet forces and local populations, seeking revenge, driven to mass suicide in remote villages. Of the 10,000 Japanese settlers in one county, only 3,420 survived. Of those, 2,300 women married local men, and 1,120 children were adopted by local families. In Siberia, 600,000 Japanese soldiers endured up to 11 years of forced labor in temperatures that plunged to 40 degrees below zero. At least 60,000 never came home. In America, 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them citizens, lost their homes, their businesses, their freedom, imprisoned behind barbed wire for the crime of their ancestry. And across all these stories, we find the most heartbreaking displacement of all, the children. For orphans who were fortunate enough to find their family, and whose family was willing to graciously take them in after returning to Japan, they lived with and received assistance mainly from their family. For orphans who don't have or cannot find family in Japan, or for orphans whose family was not willing to take them in, they were connected to NGOs and scattered to different prefectures around the country. They were once abandoned by their Japanese parents, and the Japanese state, were adopted by Chinese parents, and became Chinese citizens. Due to the special circumstances at the end of the war, they have been compelled to search for their often unverifiable deep identities. Today, survivors of the firebombing are in their 80s and 90s, still seeking recognition and compensation. Though the damage was comparable to the US atomic bombings, victims of the firebombing never received compensation, and the attack has largely been forgotten. "I don't hate Americans and I don't hold a grudge," said one Tokyo survivor. "But I do want future generations to know what happened here. I don't think that most people really understand what happened. We want to show that in war, it is the weak and vulnerable woman, the elderly, children, who are too often the victims." The displacement of Japanese families during World War II reminds us that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield, that the greatest suffering often falls upon those who never chose to fight, and that the wounds of displacement can take generations to heal, if they ever heal at all.